programme is brought to you by UCL, London's global university.
Okay, welcome everybody. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Chomsky, who, as you know, is without any shadow of doubt one of the most distinguished intellectuals alive today. His work spans the fields of philosophy, linguistics, psychology, in fact other areas of the natural sciences, and the various strands are held together by a profound wish to understand the human mind in all its complexity. I'd really like to express my deep gratitude for you accepting this invitation and being here today. The plan is for Professor Chomsky to talk about poverty of the stimulus and to introduce the topic to you for maybe 20 minutes or so, and at which point you're invited to butt in with questions. And the idea is that the event will then unfold through audience interaction, so please don't hold back. We have until 3:45, at which point, no matter what happens, I will turn off Noam's mic and force him out of the room on his way to his next engagement. Because he has to leave, there is no wine reception following the event, but if you are enthused by the discussion and want to continue after that, there are plenty of pubs in the direct vicinity of the building, and I can highly recommend our local, the Harrison, and I'm sure there are a couple of people around who would be happy to take you there. Okay, a couple of final points before we take off. I have to do my legal duty and tell you what to do in case of a fire. I think there is an exit on that side, and also you can go out this door and turn immediately right and get out of the building on that side if it becomes necessary. I should also point out that the event is recorded and it's being streamed to two other rooms in this building. Welcome people to the event. So when we start with audience interaction, there are two roving microphones in the room. The idea is that you actually use them for the benefit of people in the other rooms, because they will not be able to follow the discussion if you don't. Okay, I think that's me done. Over to you. Okay. So, on the poverty of the stimulus.
I always enjoy listening to security announcements. One of my favorites is Cape Cod near Boston. There's a nuclear power plant, so they have to have lots of instructions for how to get off the Cape. There's one bridge off the Cape, and every evening it's impossible to get off it because there's too much traffic. You know, if they ever had to evacuate the Cape, it would take weeks probably. Anyway, you might be off before the second explosion takes place. Well, poverty stimulus is a very strange concept. I mean, intellectually, I think there's just nothing to it. It's truism. But it's a very contentious issue. And especially in the cognitive sciences, generally, parts of linguistics too. And I think it's about the only interesting thing about it that I can see is why it's considered a contentious issue. That tells you something about the cognitive sciences, which I think linguists ought to know, at least from my point of view. That's the natural home. And to me, it looks like a kind of pathology in the cognitive sciences, but of course that's symmetrical, so cognitive scientists see it as a pathology of the kind of linguistics I do. But anyhow, I think that's worth working through, not just to understand it, because in many ways the future of the field depends on resolving this. If linguists can't make it clear to the immediately surrounding intellectual community that they're doing something worthwhile, there's really no reason why the field should survive. And it won't. Already it's very hard to get grants from granting agencies or papers published that make any significant use of linguistics, because it's considered to be some sort of, old-fashioned or strange confusion. And that's going to increase unless these problems are resolved wherever the pathology lies. Well, the issue of poverty, the term poverty of stimulus is only used for language, which itself is very odd, because the same question arises in every area of growth and development. There's always poverty of stimulus. I mean, that's as old as David Hume, meaning the data alone can't account for the growth and development of any system, any organic system, including cognitive systems. And that's should be a truism. In fact, it is outside the study of language or higher mental faculties in general. So the question arises for language if you think that there is a process of growth and development in acquisition of language. So if you think it's a fact that an infant, a human infant, placed in a normal environment will somehow extract from the environment instantaneously, actually intrauterine, we now know, will extract from the environment data that's language related, which is an extremely tricky process. Nobody knows how that's done. In fact, it's barely beginning to be investigated, and it's quite hard to do. You just get this massive data. How does the infant know that some of it has to do with language? Anyway, that happens almost instantaneously, reflexively, and then it appears equally reflexively, pretty much. The system develops and becomes what you and I are now using. Well, if you think that's a topic, then the question of poverty of stimulus arises. If you don't think it's a topic, then the problem doesn't arise. And in fact, a very strong tendency in the surrounding fields, and indeed in the immediate history of linguistics as well, says it isn't a topic. That what the study of language ought to be is organization of the data in a corpus, or discovering the statistical regularities in speech. And if that's the topic, then there's no poverty of stimulus problem. Of course, the problem is still there. You're just saying, not the kind of topic I look at. And in fact, that's what linguistics has been, not in the very distant past. So if you go back to, say, the 50s, the most influential philosopher, one of the most influential modern philosophers, and the main one who had tried to say something about language was W.V. Quine at Harvard. And he had a very simple answer to it, which was quite influential, that a language is just a fabric of sentences associated with one another and with stimuli by the mechanism conditioned response. And conditioned response is supposedly pretty well understood, the way you get a pigeon to peck and that sort of thing. It's now known that conditioned response probably doesn't even exist, but if it does exist, it's nothing like what it was thought to be. But the idea that that's what a language is essentially eliminates any serious question of poverty of stimulus, because the question's answered. It's just like, the way pigeons learn to peck, which turns out not to be the way they learn to peck, but aside from that, of course, there's some very serious problems with this account, but they were raised but ignored. One is a very obvious one. How do you even know that a particular piece of behavior is a sentence? I mean, if there's just a collection of things that develop by conditioned response, what makes some of them sentences? If you have no conception of language apart from that, then there's no way to pick out those bits of behavior that are sentences as distinct from those that are, basket weaving or something else. Another obvious problem is that system is going to be finite. And Quine, of course, understood perfectly well that a language is unbounded, infinite. So there's a slight problem there, how a finite system can also be infinite. But that was overlooked, and plenty of other problems. Part of the reason it was overlooked was that essentially the same view was held by linguists. Of course, incidentally, on this view, language is just going to vary accidentally. There's essentially nothing to say about language. Each person's individual history of conditioning is going to be totally different from the next person, his twin brother, and obviously different from people elsewhere. So essentially nothing general to say about language beyond whatever conditioning is. And that, in fact, was the view held by linguists. So the famous comment by Martin Jost summarizing structural linguistics. He was one of the most sophisticated theoretical linguists of the time, actually a natural scientist and so on. His view expressed in the readings in American structural linguistics in the mid-50s was that he described what he called the Boasian tradition. Whether Boas would have agreed is another question, but the Boasian tradition, which is that languages can differ in arbitrary ways, and crucially, when you study the next language, you should not have any presuppositions about a language might be. Now it would undermine what you're doing. It would be bringing a bias that shouldn't be there, because languages can vary arbitrarily. He probably didn't mean this literally, but it sort of, I'm sure he didn't mean it literally, but it kind of captured if you like, a kind of mood. Incidentally, pretty much the same was true in biology at the time. So leading biologists argued that organisms can differ in what they call virtually infinite ways. It's a funny phrase, virtually infinite, but it's used all the time. They can differ in virtually infinite ways arbitrarily, and the next organism you study, you have to recognize that you can't bring in what you know about other organisms because they differ too much. If you look at, incidentally, this is American structural linguistics, but European was almost identical. It's slightly different, but not very much. The main theoretical work in linguistics at the time was Zelig Harris's Methods in Structural Linguistics, and it was called Methods for a good reason. There was nothing to study except the methods for organizing data, and it was pretty arbitrary. You could do it one way or another, depending on what your purposes are. So you get a corpus of data, you use the methods, you give some organized structure to it, and that's the end of the story. Actually, I was a student at the time, and that's what we did. You study field methods, learn how to take data from an informant, and that's already considered pretty far out, because the obvious thing to do is what's now called corpus linguistics, which doesn't even go that far. You just take data that somehow is around there somewhere. You don't elicit it. That's already interfering with the evidence, kind of like doing an experiment instead of just observing what happens. And all of this departs so radically from the sciences for the last couple hundred years that it's kind of startling, but it's true, and it's very specific to language and other higher mental processes, which are also studied in a way that's very remote from what's taken for granted in the natural sciences for hundreds of years. It's part of the pathology. So what you do is you take a field methods course, you learn how to elicit data, you have the finite corpus, you then apply the methods, you get the phonemes, the morphemes, maybe if it's very exotic, you say something about word order and maybe phrases or something like that, and that's it. It's over. You can do it in any way you like. And I remember the feeling among students was, it's kind of fun, but what happens when we have done a phonemic analysis for every language? The field's over, And that's kind of what it looked like. There's nothing else to study. I mean, for example, Trubetskoy's Introduction to Phonology is pretty much the same set of procedures to use to find the phonemes. There were assumptions that there's something there that's fixed, like maybe distinctive features, but they were supposedly keyed to articulatory and acoustic properties, so they sort of came for free from some other system. But very little beyond that. Well, I think it's a fair, and in fact, the topics that were studied were almost entirely phonology and morphology. Those are things that are bound, you could at least pretend that they're bounded. Not literally, but they're pretty much bounded. So you don't have to worry about the fact that the system grows indefinitely. And they also are they look very varied. So they look quite different from language to language, person to person. And they look pretty complex. Also, they're very much susceptible to change over the centuries. So that and anything beyond that just wasn't studied, barely studied, kind of few observations. It's not entirely true. So if you go to people like, say, Otto Jespersen, it wasn't true. But he was so marginal that you didn't even read his work. I mean, I found it in the library, poking around in Widener Library. Nobody studied it. And if you look at the few reviews of his work by Leonard Bloomfield and others, it was mostly very disparaging. It's kind of mystical philosophy. That tradition, which goes back a couple hundred years, had pretty much died. I think that was exaggeration, of course, it's short, but I think it's a pretty fair description of what the field was like in the 50s. And that fit very well with the view that there's nothing to acquisition, growth and development of the language other than, say, Quine's view, fabric of sentences, any combination of them that happens to have been associated in an individual history, and it's the end of the story. Well, under those conditions, the question of poverty stimulus does not arise. If the only topic is data organization and methods for doing it, then the fact that the elementary fact that children go through the process that I described doesn't even arise. Now, it's interesting that back in the 50s, the modern study of language acquisition was just taking off with work like, say, Roger Brown's, but take a close look at the way the work was carried out. It's very informative. So Roger Brown, who kind of pioneered a lot of it, his work on language acquisition was pure recording of observed data, period. And any suggestion you should go beyond that was just dismissed. So if you've studied this stuff, you know that the early proposals coming from Brown's work and others were that children go through a period of what's called telegraphic speech. That was one of the great discoveries. So, say a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, you take a look at what they're producing, and they don't use function words. So they have nouns and verbs, but not much in the way of prepositions or other function words. So it was assumed that that's what the child knows. Now, there were suggestions. I mean, I know I argued with Roger for a long time about this, that you could do an experiment to find out whether that's true. And in fact, the experiment would almost certainly show that it's false, as it finally did when it was done a little later. There were people like Lila Gleitman who recognized that this is crazy and started doing serious work on language acquisition. And in fact, a couple of her students did the obvious experiment. It was quite a lot later. I don't think it was published till the late 60s, 10 years after this, in which they found what's obviously true, that a kid in the telegraphic speech period knows exactly where the function words goes. They just don't pronounce them. And you can test it in perfectly obvious ways. So have the mother speak to the kid in 3 different ways: in telegraphic speech, which is supposed to be their own language, in normal speech, and a third category in telegraphic speech with the function word to say randomly distributed. And you get exactly what you'd predict. Kid can't understand telegraphic speech at all. It just sounds like gibberish. Similarly, the randomly distributed ones just confuse. And normal speech I understand perfectly. So what that means is obvious, that they actually have the whole thing in their heads, and for one reason or another, they're not producing it. It took a long time for this to become the way in which language acquisition is studied. And up until today, it's still, by now, it's kind of like a regression. It's considered an exotic way to do it. You just should look for statistic regularities in the data. Well, if you decide to take seriously the virtual truism about language, that infants do exactly what I described, which is sort of obvious, and secondly, that other organisms don't do it, which is kind of surprising. So if a kid has, say, a pet chimpanzee or songbird or whatever it may be, who gets exactly the same data, they, of course, don't even take the first step. They don't pick out language-relevant data from the environment, which ought to be surprising, especially with recent studies of chimpanzee auditory systems. Turns out they have about the same auditory system as humans, and they even seem to be keyed to distinctive features. So there's special responses to what we consider distinctive features for language. So it looks like they're getting essentially the same information, but whenever it gets inside, nothing happens to it. It doesn't go anywhere. Songbirds have something like a kind of a syntax. Some of them do, and it's sort of interesting, but obviously they can't do anything like this. And it's not a matter of peripheral sensory motor systems, because if you translate everything into whatever the animal's sensory motor system is, for chimpanzees, you don't even have to do it because it's the same, but essentially the same. But for others, if you translate it, the same result, nothing happens. So that's two trivial facts. One of them, language acquisition. Two, the fact that it's only special about humans. And elementary rationality tells you, or should tell you, that there's some genetic property of humans which determines that they can do this. There's a name for it in modern linguistics. It's called UG. Which is totally misunderstood even by a lot of professional linguists. It's confused with something different, universal grammar in a sort of traditional sense, collections of generalizations about language, say Greenberg's generalizations, which are very valuable, and it's useful to have Greenberg's generalizations. Generalizations about some complex system are going to have exceptions. It'd be a miracle if they didn't, because the generalization is typically based on interaction of lots of different factors, and the deviations, the exceptions, are very important. They don't throw out the field the way it's understood to happen these days. They tell you exactly where to look for something interesting. So to take a classic analogy from the physical sciences, back in the mid-19th century, observations of planetary motion showed that Uranus does not have a perfect elliptical orbit. Something's going wrong with it, the perturbations of the orbit. Well, nobody said, let's throw out Kepler's laws and Newton's laws. What they said is, okay, let's try to figure out why. Well, pretty soon they found Neptune. Okay, then the explanation works. And it's exactly the same if you look at language. So take, say, ECP, for example, principle that determines that for English you can say how many cars did you wonder if the mechanics fixed, but you can't say how many mechanics did you wonder if fixed the cars. It's a fine thought, you can express it in a paraphrase, but you just can't say it for some reason. So that's an instance of ECP. Well, it's a generalization. And it was noticed, I think over 30 years ago, that there's exceptions. Luigi Rizzi was the first person to point out that it doesn't work for null subject languages. There, the sentence is fine. You know? Well, again, a rational reaction is not, okay, no generalizations, let's throw out the field. But it's exactly what Luigi did, which most of you know. He pointed out that the null subject languages, if you look at them carefully, at least the ones he was studying, like Italian, have another position from which extraction can take place. They have a post-verbal subject position. You can extract from that position. It doesn't violate ECP. So, yeah, that's kind of like discovering Neptune. And that's the way generalizations and exceptions to them should be regarded. Those of you who are familiar with the literature, that's very far from true. Exceptions to generalizations are regarded as somehow lethal demonstration that the whole field is wrong. Another very famous recent paper that's circulated all over the place, which a number of people, including Daniel Harbour, is probably here somewhere, have pointed out that all the data are wrong. But putting that aside, even if they were right, it wouldn't make any difference because you expect to find exceptions to generalizations. UG, on the other hand, is exceptionless. That's the genetic property that humans share, and there's very good evidence that they in fact share it. There's no known group differences among detectable ones, at least, for acquisition of language. There are individual differences, kind of at the fringes, but I don't think anybody's ever detected a group difference, which itself is kind of interesting. It means that ever since humans left Africa and started spreading all over the place, maybe 50,000 years ago, there's been no evolution. That's important. There's a field called evolution of language, which has a burgeoning literature, most of which, in my view, is total nonsense. But anyway, it's growing. In fact, it isn't even about evolution of language. It's almost entirely speculations about evolution of communication, which is a different topic. You know? And it's kind of a natural topic to look at if you're caught up in another myth, a misinterpretation of evolutionary theory, which holds that changes take place only incrementally, you know, small change and another small change, and you know, finally you get complex organisms. That was believed at one time, and you can find sentences in Darwin you can quote if that's the Bible. But for a long time, evolutionary biologists who understood it doesn't work like that. You can have quite sudden changes, small changes that lead to huge phenomenal differences. And in the area of communication, you can mislead yourself into believing that since every organism you think of, bacteria to humans, has some kind of communication system, so maybe our communication system is just a slight modification of, you know, primates or whatever you like. It's undoubtedly not true, but at least you can delude yourself into believing it. On the other hand, language, it just seems totally separate. There's nothing even remotely analogous, nothing at all homologous as far as anyone knows. The few things that look similar, like, say, songbirds, are at such a distance from an evolutionary point of view that it's just got to be convergent evolution to the extent that there's a similarity. And there's interesting questions you can study, but only if you take biology in the last 50 years seriously. If you're back to the pop Darwinism that you learned in 8th grade, that's no good, you know. Anyhow, the fact that there's been no evolution in 50,000 years is interesting. If anybody really wants to study evolution of language, it raises a lot of questions. I don't want to get too far from poverty of stimulus. The poverty of stimulus question will arise if you recognize the two things I mentioned. Infants almost reflexively acquire language capacity, and in fact, as we now know and learn more and more as experimental techniques get better, they know an awful lot of it before they exhibit anything. In fact, it might turn out they know almost everything by the time they're say, a year and a half old. There's actually some evidence for that. But maybe not every word or something, but the basic structure of the language. Interesting evidence, in fact. But that's one fact. And the other fact is it's uniquely human. From those two facts, it follows there's got to be a genetic component, and some aspect of it has to be unique to humans. That's elementary. So that's poverty of stimulus. End of discussion in a rational world. But we don't live in a rational world. The world we live in is one in which, and in fact the environment that immediately surrounds linguistics, the intellectual environment, and in fact includes a lot of linguistics. In that environment, UG is a kind of a dirty word. If you want a grant from the National Science Foundation, you better not include that in your proposal. It'll be knocked out before it even reaches the review board. And the reason is that it's just got to be true that something like what Quine said is correct. And nowadays it wouldn't be put in terms of conditioned response, but in terms of what are called sophisticated Bayesian techniques. If you want to get a grant approved, you have to have the phrase sophisticated Bayesian in it. And you also have to ask for an fMRI, even if you don't have anything to do with it. You know? But if you meet those two conditions, you might make it through the granting procedure. But if you use a dirty word like UG and you say there's something special about humans and you got to find out what it is, that pretty well rules it out. I'm not joking. I have concrete cases in mind of very good work that just can't get funded because it doesn't meet these conditions, right at MIT, in fact. But well, let me go on with that. Okay. So what do we actually find in the field surrounding us? Actually, I don't want to talk about. I'll give an example just to illustrate. The current issue of the main journal in cognitive science, called Cognitive Science. There's an article that just came out a week or so ago by two researchers and basically connectionists, neural net researchers, Luxo and Calvo. And the title is, How Many Mechanisms Are Needed to Analyze Speech? Okay, now the presupposition is, well, obviously one mechanism is needed, sophisticated Bayesian analysis. But are there any other mechanisms needed? That's the question. And they discuss an exotic hypothesis called the more than one mechanism hypothesis, which holds that along with statistical analysis, maybe you have to have something else, something about rule systems. And then the gist of the paper is to show that everything, not just about speech, but about, well, the question, I'll read it, whether the language can be acquired. The question is whether language can be acquired, everything about it, solely by statistical learning mechanisms, or whether rule-following mechanisms are required as well. Again, it's kind of interesting that the question is posed that way, even before we get into it. And this is not just this paper, it's kind of like near universal. It's interesting because if you look at statistical methods, the results are virtually zero. There's almost nothing that has come out of it. I'll come back to more details. And if you look at what came out of studying, postulated rule systems, it's a pretty rich, complex set of results. But the assumption is null hypothesis, just statistical methods, with the usual words tossed in like sophisticated Bayesian. For those of you who know anything about sophisticated Bayesian methods know that it's fine statistical technique, but whatever data you've got, virtually no matter what it is, you can find a Bayesian analysis that will model it. It's because you have enough leeway in formulating prior hypotheses, hypotheses about how to evaluate evidence and so on. That's been pointed out over and over. But, if you think that the field is just about modeling data, that's not a problem. In fact, that's an advantage. So whatever the data is, language, some, mirror image language, whatever it may be, anything, you can discuss a model, and that's called a success. interestingly. Actually, that's a new notion of success, which has never existed in the natural sciences. It's never been, I mean, people do try to model data, but in order to try to discover what the principles are that lead to the account of the data, maybe a model will help you. But no, I don't think there's anything in the history of science that has ever considered modeling of data to be a successful achievement, except with regard to language. And it's not done today either, elsewhere in the cognitive or biological sciences. So, for example, take, say, bee communication. Nobody, if you try to get a grant from the National Science Foundation in which you say, I'm going to put aside all these complicated experiments that bee scientists carry out, like, having bees fly over a lake to see if the odor trail was something that they follow, or, blinding one of their eyes or some other complicated thing. I'm not going to do any of that. I'm just going to construct a sophisticated Bayesian model which will account for massive number of videotapes of bees swarming. Okay, so these bees are humming around the hive, and some guy comes back and goes like that, and everybody else goes off to the hive, and everyone's happy. So you take a lot of tapes of that, endless numbers, do a lot of analysis of them. You get a pretty good account of what happens when bees swarm, and furthermore, you get a pretty good prediction of what's going to happen next time. A far better prediction than bee scientists can give, or would care about, for that matter. So you're done. We can stop the complicated experiments. In fact, you can do the same with physics. So if you take a videotape of what's happening outside that window there, leaves moving around and all kind of stuff, and do a complicated statistical analysis of, pile of videotapes, you get a pretty good prediction of what's likely to happen out of the window next. Again, far better than what any quantum theory professor here can predict. And they can't even explain, as Hilary Putnam once noted, why a round peg won't go into a square hole. That's considered too complicated to investigate, and certainly aren't going to try to explain what's happening outside the window. So, okay, we can throw out the physics department and just do sophisticated Bayesian analysis. I mean, if anybody makes proposals like that properly, everyone laughs. But not when it's the study of language. There, not only do people not laugh, but they take it very seriously. And in fact, it's kind of squeezing the space in which a topic that tries to deal with questions rationally in the manner of the natural science in which that topic can survive, the field can survive, which is worth our thinking about. Well, let me go on with this paper. So the question is, do we need anything beyond sophisticated analysis, sophisticated statistical analysis? And then it goes on to point out that the idea that everything could be done by statistical analysis, kind of cognitive scientists came to understand that when a paper came out by Safran, Aslan, and Newport about 15 years ago, is showing that in highly simplified artificial languages, you could, children and adults could pick out, could identify statistical transitional probabilities. It's roughly what you expect word boundaries to be. It's a point where the transitional probability goes down. You can't predict what's going to happen next. So they were able to do this in artificial languages, and that showed that maybe statistical analysis can do everything. And then comes a list of papers which are supposedly showing great results. Every one of them is a total failure if you look at it, but literally by the standards of the sciences. It's worth looking at the papers. Every one of them does something like what I described about bees or physics. It kind of predicts things about some complex array of data, but in a manner which you can falsify in 1 second just by thinking about the properties of the system. But that doesn't matter because that's intrusive. That's like asking 50 years ago whether kids actually have telegraphic speech by doing the obvious experiment that a lot of students finally carried out. So it's interfering with the data. It's not the way we work. So that's that. Then comes the next point. It says, notwithstanding the consensus that statistical mechanisms would lie behind word segmentation, presumably everything else, despite that, there's still this exotic MOM hypothesis that some people advance, deluded by poverty of stimulus arguments. That's, that there's some other mechanism. And then they go on to do an experiment to refute that. The experiment is one in which they construct a connectionist model that shows that if you have again an artificial language, simplified artificial language, then that's the stimulus. You can get a connectionist model which will identify transitional probabilities even over a word bound a space, when there's some other irrelevant material in between. So that shows that all of language can be acquired by statistical methods, and there's no need for the MOM hypothesis. That's literally the paper. I urge you to read it. I won't go into the details. To me, it's kind of amazing that it can even be published. It's so ludicrous, but even more amazing that it's taken seriously. And there's more to say about that, so let me say a few more things. Actually, there's a couple of things wrong with this hypothesis that just even take the quite trivial question of word segmentation. It's been known for years that the method of looking at transitional probabilities doesn't work. It can work for an artificial simplified language, but if you try it for a natural language corpus, you get syllables. Charles Yang showed that years ago, and also showed a way around it. Namely, if you combine looking for transitional probabilities with prosodic information, you get a much better approximation. Since then, there's more complex work by Shukla, Aslan, and others, which shows that if you bring in prosodic boundaries, which are pretty complex notions, in fact, probably syntax-related notions, then you get a reasonably good a prediction of where word boundaries will be in continued speech. So it's well known that the thing that they're saying is the basis for everything is wrong. And of course, they don't cite any of these experiments because they're all tainted. They all assume that there's something about language that plays a role. So they're tainted and therefore not mentioned. Second problem about this is that the whole idea is completely unrealistic. I mean, it's almost a certainty that that's not the way infants segment speech. And after all, kids know some words. And if they hear the word in connected speech, that's going to give them some information about where to put the boundaries. So the idea that this is how infants segment speech is virtually impossible. And if you look at the actual method, you might actually learn something. Third point that's disregarded is that even if this were to work, it's utterly marginal. Segmenting continuous discourse into words is such a marginal aspect of language that virtually nobody ever talked about it, which leads to the fourth point. It was talked about in the early days of generative grammar, like in logical structure of linguistic theory, and the same idea was proposed, that maybe you segment things into words by looking at transitional probabilities. Well, that can never be mentioned either, though everybody knows it, because there's supposed to be a battle going on between statistical theories and generative grammar, so it wouldn't do to say, look, there's no battle. We all sort of agreed on this 60 years ago. And interestingly, it turns out to be wrong. As I mentioned, it's much more interesting. It involves at least prosodic boundaries, which leads you into complex notions of how syntax and superficial phonetics interact. There's a whole story there, which you know about. Nevertheless, that's it. That's the basis for, they're correct in saying that's pretty much the basis for the very broad consensus that there's a null hypothesis, everything's done by statistics, and there's an exotic hypothesis that maybe something else, something mystical is involved. Well, there are attempts to go beyond this, and some are pretty interesting. Some of the best work on this has been done, in fact, by Charles Yang, a computer scientist, got his PhD at MIT with Bob Berwick. He has a book about 10 years ago, which has some interesting results on how to, what you can discover by interacting a reasonable probabilistic learning technique with properties of language, universal grammar properties. So, for example, one topic that he studied, and I think pretty well answered, is one that has been the favorite of connectionist work forever. There's a ton of connectionist work trying to deal with the not terribly interesting question of how irregular verbs in English are learned. So there's some regularities, and there's age in which kids overgeneralize and then they get it straight, and so on and so forth. There's elaborate connectionist models trying to deal with this. They all totally fail. Then a more complicated one comes. There's a book by Steve Pinker about it, which he said, something else. The first interesting conclusion about this, at least that I know of, is Charles Yang's dissertation. He borrowed a suggestion of Morris Halley's, and he wanted to investigate an actually interesting question. Why is it that in some cases low probability irregular verbs behave like high probability ones? That's contrary to everything that's assumed. And he found a reason, Morris's proposal, which is that the irregular verbs are broken down into categories. They're types. So there's the ablaut type and some other type and so on. And words are assigned to those categories. And then the low frequency words in those categories are treated like the average probability of the words, which could be very high. And that turns out to give a very good fit to everything that's known, and also answers an interesting question, which is not just, modeling the data, but why does this strange thing happen? It's interesting that in all the literature that I've seen listing the successes of statistical approaches, this one's never mentioned. None of his work is ever mentioned, just like the Shukla-Aslan work is not mentioned. I think the reason is pretty obvious. All the work is considered tainted. It goes into the MOM hypothesis that there's something apart from statistical methods, and that's virtual heresy. There are a couple of cases in which work, this is pretty standard in the cognitive sciences generally, but there it's kind of like just hand-waving. But in computational cognitive science, which is the more interesting part, this is almost literal dogma, and that has the advantage that you can actually investigate the proposals because they're precise. If you're programming it for a computer, it's clear. You can see what happens. And there are a couple of cases, actually I only know of two, where there's been an attempt to go beyond trivialities, which they've got wrong anyway, but to go beyond misunderstood trivialities to something real. Actually, two cases that I know of. One of them is kind of a small industry, and it's concerned with an interesting question, a question that arose about 60 years ago when the first work in generative grammar, what von Riemsdyk and Hoiberg's called the generative enterprise, when it just began. As soon as it began, and as soon as you asked the question, well, what could be the process that determines the expressions that you use and understand, and what could be the common basis for them. As soon as that question was open for discussion, and something quite interesting happened. It suddenly turned out that nobody understood anything. It was assumed before that everything is understood. Literally, there were no puzzles in the field, no problems, just more data collection. But as soon as you asked the question, what could the generative mechanisms be, it turned out that there were no answers to anything. Everything you looked at was a complete puzzle. That's kind of reminiscent of the very early days of modern science. You go back to, say, the 17th century. Just think about simple things. You probably all know this, but they're worth thinking about, because it's very much like science in that period in this field. So, for example, for millennia, scientists had an answer to a very simple question. Suppose there's boiling water in here, and I let go of the cup, then the cup will fall down and the steam will rise. Okay. In fact, wasn't a puzzle, because Aristotle had given an answer. The answer is everything's going to its natural place. The cup's natural place is down there, and the steam's natural place is up there. So for 2 millennia, it's not a short time, the best scientists, and they were quite good ones, had an answer to the question. When Galileo and others like him allowed themselves to be puzzled about this, modern science begins. First of all, what's the natural place? Secondly, your intuitions all turn out to be totally wrong, like about mass and rate of fall and so on. And then everything's puzzling, and you try to deal with the puzzles, you find more puzzles. That's modern science. You still have plenty of puzzles, like where's 90% of the universe? Can't find it. But that doesn't end the field, of course. And that's why they have a huge machine in CERN in Switzerland that's trying to find, Higgs bosons and that kind of business. But everything is puzzling. You try to deal with the puzzles. You don't accept the simple answers anymore. You question them, and you don't try to model data. That's totally ridiculous. And we're in that position. Anyway, as soon as the first efforts were made in the 50s, you immediately found any number of puzzles. One of them took on a life of its own. And in fact, it's virtually identified in the field with poverty of stimulus. And there's a substantial literature in the computational cognitive science field trying to deal with this puzzle and to show that it really isn't a puzzle, because you can just figure it out through statistical analysis. And that's the question of structure dependence of rules. So, for example, it's simple to write down, but if you have a simple sentence like, say, can eagles that swim fly? Okay. Everyone knows that the word can goes along with fly. It doesn't go along with swim. So you're asking, can they fly, not can they swim? And there's morphological evidence that corresponds to it. So are eagles that swim flying, but not are eagles that flying swim, say. That's a perfectly fine thought. There's nothing wrong. It's like the ECP example I mentioned. There's nothing wrong with the thought. Is it the case that eagles that are flying swim, but you just can't say it that way? Everyone knows that. They know it without experience. Why? It's not at all obvious why. What's happening, and it's of course not just this case, it generalizes all over the place, is that the relation between a word, say a morpheme in this case, and some position in the sentence is determined not by linear distance, but by structural distance. And that's pretty puzzling, because linear distance is much easier to compute. The linear distance is a trivial computation. You just count, A structural distance is sophisticated computation. First of all, you have to have a structure. So you have to impose the structure somehow. And what mental operations impose the structure can get quite complex. But nevertheless, that's the way it's universally done. And not just this case, but every case where the question comes up. Linear distance isn't used. Structural distance is used. Well, this has spawned a substantial literature to try to show that there's nothing there, just statistical analysis. And by odd coincidence, in that same issue of the Journal of Cognitive Science, the one that just came out, there's another article by Bob Berwick and a couple other people, me included, which goes through the whole literature and shows that every case that's suggested has some interesting properties. One, it's a total failure. Two, it's unresurrectable. There's no way to overcome the failure. Three, it wouldn't matter if they were correct, because the same methods would work just as well if it worked the other way. So if you made up a language which used linear distance, not structural distance, the methods will give you this. They'll work anyhow, so it doesn't matter if they were right. Four, they're all regarded as successes. So if you read later literature, these are the articles that are listed as showing, yeah, we can accept the null hypothesis, nothing but statistical analysis. And the reason is because of this notion of success that I mentioned. If your notion of success is sort of approximating unanalyzed data, like, you know, what's happening outside the window or bee swarming or something like that, that's a success under this novel conception of success that I don't think has ever existed in any rational discipline, certainly in the natural sciences. So that's what the literature is like. New papers coming out all the time. One came out in Cognition just a couple months ago. Total has all of these properties. And that's the nature of the field that we're part of. And as I mentioned, that's pretty serious, because if that gap remains, this kind of mutual disregard or maybe even contempt, the field's not going to survive. You can already see signs of it. There's only one other example that I know of, which is, actually this does raise interesting questions, I should say. Why, if once you allow yourself to be puzzled, like why should it work this way, the answers are by no means obvious. As I mentioned, linear distance is a lot easier to calculate. One possible answer, in fact, maybe the right one, is that at the point in mental calculation in the generative process at which operations are being carried out, there isn't any ordering. Okay? There isn't any ordering. Now that would mean essentially that narrow syntax and formal semantics don't use ordering. And that appears to be true for the core of what people do in formal syntax. Order doesn't seem to matter. All that seems to matter is hierarchy. The hierarchical structure, whatever the order is, it comes out the same. And that's kind of expected, because languages would say a different word order are going to be interpreted the same way. There's no differences in interpretation that connect to it. At a kind of superficial level, there are some differences in interpretation that may have to do with order, but like focus, things like that. But for the core semantic process, it just doesn't matter at all. Say anaphora, thematic roles, inference, and so on. Well, if that's true of that output level, that interface level, that means that narrow syntax shouldn't have order either. And then why does it appear in the sense from the sensory motor system? That's because the sensory motor system requires it. Not just order, but some kind of arrangement. And the arrangement will be different depending on what the modality is. So if the modality, say, sign, there's different kinds of arrangements, so things can be simultaneous. Like, whether something's a question depends on whether you raised your eyebrows all the way through it, that sort of thing. So depending on the modality, sense modality, some kind of ordering or more general arrangement is going to be imposed, which strongly suggests that order is just a property of externalization. And I think there's good reason to think that externalization is peripheral to language. It just has to do with kind of like an accident. We have to get it out of our sensory motor system somehow to reach other people. And it'll go on in different ways, different modalities, done by touch. As far as anyone knows, any modality will work. But speech, at least, is going to be ordered roughly. I mean, there's prosody and so on. But fundamentally ordered. So maybe order is just a superficial phenomenon, which has nothing to do with the way the core of language is working. And at the point in mental computations when you're dealing with examples like the one I mentioned, there isn't any order anyway, so you don't have a choice between linear and structural order. It's just structural distance. That would be a far-reaching answer with a lot of consequences. Is it true? There you run into interesting empirical questions. Like there is serious empirical work arguing the contrary, like Richie Kames, for example, who argues quite interesting ways that order is plays a bigger role in the core processes than just externalization. So now you have an interesting question, the kind that you hope to find in research. You have empirical evidence that seems to go both ways, and you have conceptual evidence that goes only one way. Well, what do you do in those cases? Okay, here research intuitions diverge, so there's no point arguing. My own feeling is the way you should go is assume the conceptual arguments are probably right and try to find a way around the empirical arguments, but that's not so simple. Anyhow, the point is it goes into interesting directions as soon as you look at the problem seriously. As when you just throw sophisticated Bayesian at the problem, there's nothing interesting that comes out, and it all fails, and it's called a success. And that's pretty standard in the field. Now, there's only one other example I've been able to find in the computational cognitive science literature that goes beyond speech segmentation, which, as I mentioned, is misinterpreted. That has to do with anaphora. There's a paper by Chater and Christensen, two of the main people in the field, who suggest that anaphora, this isn't statistical, they say that condition A of the binding theory is just a normal cognitive process, a process of trying to resolve a problem as quickly as possible. So the anaphora picks the closest antecedent so as to resolve it as quickly as possible. So takes they expect to see each other is looking for an antecedent, the closest one is they, so gets that one. You've got condition A of the binding theory, you don't need any UG, just simple cognitive processes. And it takes about 1 minute to find counterexamples, and everybody knows them. And furthermore, they were all well known before the article appeared. So to take the most obvious, suppose you stick who in front of the sentence. So who do they expect to see each other? Okay, doesn't work. Intuitively, it's obvious why it doesn't work. There's a hidden antecedent that's blocking each other relation. It's the subject of see, except it's not pronounced. So it's what you're hearing in your mind is something like, who do they expect who to see each other? And the who is the closest antecedent, so that's the one you're going to find. But you can't get that out of data. You can't get that from analysis of data. In fact, to try to figure out why that's happening takes you deeply into questions of how what UG is, how mental operations work, what the general procedures are. You get into questions of reconstruction, all kinds of interesting topics. But all of that is off the agenda. You have to get the answer from just simple data processing of exhibited data. And once you point this out, along comes some more complicated statistical analysis. All missing the point, that there's a very simple analysis, but involves non-trivial phenomena. Well, as far as I know, that pretty much encapsulates the field. I can't find anything else. And it's worth looking at carefully. You guys are too polite. You're supposed to be interrupting me. I can go on indefinitely. Just stop me. Yeah.
So you mentioned that in that paper in cognitive science of yours that just came out, that you think all of the literature that review there is a failure in terms of addressing the relevant problems. From
rational perspective.
But can I? So I don't quite agree with that assessment. For example, so if you take the work by Amy Perforce and her colleagues.
Right. The one that just came out in Cognition.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think you can, what you guys point out is correct. They don't give us semantics, so they don't.
No, that's not what we pointed out.
So they.
That's not what we pointed out. It's much more trivial what's wrong with it. Amy and Josh Tenenbaum and others don't want to hear it, but actually that paper demonstrates zero. If you take a look at first of all, the idea that it has anything to do with structural distance is not true. It says nothing about that. But there's a narrower claim. They argue that they can show that they can give an explanation of why children acquire hierarchical structure. That's supposed to answer a question. But take a look at how they show it. They invent 3 possible systems. One of them is finite. So you throw that out instantly. You can't have a finite system of overflow memory in no time. So that one's out. The other 2 systems are hierarchical. So of course you pick a hierarchical system when those are your choices. Now they redefine the notion hierarchical to try to get out of this. Of the 2 systems, one of them is strictly right branching. And they say, okay, well that's not really hierarchical. It's just as hierarchical as anything else. It just happens to be right branching. But even if we accept that, option is thrown out in 1 minute by discovering that they're phrases. So if you have the sentence, the man saw the boy, and you know that the man is a unit, okay, that throws out the linear one, the right-bounded one, the right branching one. So of the 3 systems proposed, one of them is totally impossible because it's finite, so it's never even considered. The second one is refuted by virtually the most elementary observation. You're left with the third one, which of course is picked because that's the only option allowed. And the third one, to make it worse, happens to be an extremely complex context-free grammar, which nobody would even conceive of as a possible account of a language. For one thing, context-free grammars themselves were understood to be irrelevant to language 50 years ago. And this particular, for very good reasons, and this particular context-free grammar is so complex it couldn't even be a candidate. And furthermore, it totally misgenerates. And we didn't bother going into it actually in earlier versions of that paper, which were about half a dozen versions of that paper were rejected for publication. I just got sick of it. I was told Bob I don't want to bother anymore, but he went on anyway, and he enlisted Paul Piotrowski to help rewrite it. And I kind of agreed to put my name on it, but without much enthusiasm, because the published paper, in my view, is so simple-minded that it's almost embarrassing. There's a long discussion of poverty of stimulus at the beginning, which is okay, but it's the kind of thing that anybody ought to know in kindergarten. But the trouble is, without putting that in, they wouldn't consider the paper, So I did agree to have my name on it, but reluctantly. But the third proposal, at the earlier versions, we went through it in detail. I can send you earlier drafts if you want to see it. But the proposed context-free grammar is wild, It not just partially misgenerates, it radically misgenerates in the simplest way. So it isn't even a candidate, but since it's the only candidate in their 3-option system, that's the one people have to pick. So the fact of the matter is the paper has 0 results. And it's not because it doesn't give us semantics. That's more sophisticated. Of course it doesn't give us semantics, but...
I'm the author of another one of the total failures that's addressed in that talk.
The author of one of the other total failures.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So it seems that I'm one of the authors of the Clark and Hérault paper on learning substitutable context-free grammars.
We have been discussing that.
I think you're absolutely right to criticize it on a number of respects because it is a very, very preliminary result. One of the one of the surprising things about that paper is it was only written 5 years ago, as opposed to being written in the 60s, when it would be maybe more appropriate.
Written in the 60s, because it was already known in the 60s why it couldn't possibly work.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so I think when you say it's irresurrectible, that's a little harsh, because as I understand it, your favorite proposal for dealing with some of these things has been formalized by Ed Stabler as minimalist grammars. I know you have some qualifications about that. Minimalist grammars are weakly and strongly equivalent to a formalism called multiple context-free grammars.
To what?
Multiple context-free grammars.
Yeah.
Okay.
In fact, that was I proved theorems about that in the late 50s.
Okay. And recently this work is being extended so that it can learn a large subclass of multiple context-free grammars. Okay. So
in fact, there's a theorem about that in 1959, which basically captures the result, which points out that context-free grammars are strongly equivalent, hence of course weakly equivalent, to non-deterministic linear bounded automata, which are they're basically what parsing systems are. Every parsing system is some kind of a non-deterministic linear bounded automata. So yeah, they can get results which are strongly equivalent to a context-free grammar. Yeah. But that's from 1959.
Yes. Well, multiple context-free grammars are different formalisms.
Context-free grammars will give you the same result. Yeah. And it didn't mean anything then, and it doesn't mean anything now. Part of the reason it didn't mean anything then was perfectly well known. Context-free grammars are no use for language.
Yes, I understand. This formalism, though, involves something that is formally equivalent to movement and can handle displaced constituents.
That's right. There are a lot of ways of handling it, all wrong, because there's an elementary way of handling it, which comes for free. What doesn't seem to be understood in the computational cognitive science literature is that movement, you have to stipulate a barrier against it. It comes for free. As soon as you have the most elementary computational operation, which is hidden somewhere in every computational procedure, the operation that's now called merge, which just says, if you have two elements you've already generated, make up a new one. Okay, every computational procedure has that hidden in it somewhere. So you just say, let's suppose that's the only operation. Okay, and let's furthermore add a very reasonable principle that computation is efficient. That is, that less computation is better than more computation. Okay, not a sophisticated principle. Just that. Okay, it follows you get movement. Period. Over. Discussion over.
Yes, I understand that, but you still need to have a story about how this might be acquired.
What?
You still need to have a story about how these systems, these grammars, however they're defined, you still need However, you still need to have a way of explaining how they can be acquired or learned.
How can be acquired? Well, if the only operation is the operation that appears in every computational system, yeah, you have to have a story, but you have the story. It's a fact that somewhere along the line in evolutionary history, at some point, uncontroversially, that humans got the capacity for unbounded computation. Which means at the very least, they had to have the minimal computational operation, namely merge, maybe a lot more, but at least that. And if they have only that, and the general principle of keeping computation efficient, which is a natural law, that's on a par with, meiosis giving spheres, not cubes. You don't have to argue about that. If that's the way it is, well, the question's over.
I simply don't understand how that accounts for language acquisition, because there are differences between the different languages.
The fact that whatever language acquisition is going on, it's going to have move, because that comes for free.
Yes, I understand that, but the question is, how are these systems acquired? How does the child learn which items can combine with which other items? Which items can be?
See, then you're asking, how do you learn that you can say, that read combines with book and not with in. Okay, that comes from looking at data that's trivial.
Okay, so
And in fact, these proposals say absolutely nothing about it.
Well, okay, in which case, haven't you more or less conceded the point here that you've more or less conceded the point that what acquisition does takes place through systems of data-driven learning?
It takes place what?
Through systems of data-driven learning.
How could it be any otherwise? I mean, otherwise I'd be speaking Swahili. Yeah, obviously in any system of growth and development, whether it's the visual system, the immune system, the language system, whatever you like, there are always several factors that enter into it. That doesn't matter. Can't use these things anyway. Any such system, just virtually by logic, and it's never even questioned in the biological sciences because it's so obvious, is going to involve external data, which have an effect on the way it develops. So like in the visual system, it's known that if you manipulate early visual stimulation, you get totally different visual systems, radically different. Data, some sort of genetic component, which for cognitive systems maps the data into experience, which is a different notion. And then you have natural law. And that's true for everything. So if it's true for everything, it's going to be true for language. So in the case of language, the data could be the data from English, it could be data from Swahili, whatever it is. That's going to have an effect, just like manipulation of the early days of visual experience will have an effect, in fact, a gross effect. The genetic component is what we're trying to discover. That's UG. And natural law will be things like computational efficiency. Well, okay, that's not enough to answer everything, but that's the framework of any answer. So of course it'll involve data.
Okay, well, in which case, why do you object to these concrete proposals
because the
with associated mathematical theories and theorems that prove they're correct?
No,
to explain this.
I oppose them because they are totally wrong. They're based on assumptions which are untrue. When the results are proposed, they're wildly off, and you know why they're off. They're off, and there's a fundamental reason why they're off, because they're off for the same way it would be off to propose an alternative to physics of the kind that I mentioned. Let's just do data analysis of what's happening outside the window, and we'll get some kind of model, and we'll be able to predict pretty well what's happening next. Way better than the physics department. But people laugh about it because it's right. You should laugh about it. And when you do that with language, you get equally laughable results. They're wildly wrong. There's no way to correct them. And they're called successes. And it wouldn't matter if they were right. So if you take the paper you're mentioning, I mean, essentially the same methods would work for an invented language which kept to linear order rather than structural order. Essentially the same methods will give you the result for that. Well, you know, that's enough to tell any rational person, look, this is off the track. I mean, there's a property we're trying to discover. Why do you use structural order, not linear order? And it's not just for this example, can eagles that swim fly. It's for every example in every language where the question even arises. Okay, so making a proposal that even if it worked, would work for this case and would work equally well if the opposite were true and doesn't apply to any of the other cases that are all over the place, that's just not a rational procedure. It's never done in the sciences.
But these approaches have strong, I'll finish now. But these approaches do have strong biases, and they have a strong bias towards a certain class of hierarchically structured representations. And the difference is that rather than the acquisition being done by sort of parameter setting or something else, it's done by distributional learning, by examining patterns in the data.
Yeah,
and you seem to have a deeper objection to that class of
no,
model.
I think that's fine if you get any results. But when the results are all zero, and it wouldn't matter if the facts were the opposite, you'd still get results, and it doesn't apply to the next case you look at, then why bother?
Nick, could you want to follow up? I saw your hand earlier.
Oh, yeah. Well, I wanted to ask about the G in UG. So you mentioned The G, why G as in grammar? So you mentioned that there's something special about people which allows them to acquire language and animals don't. That must be right. But if that logical necessity is all that's driving the concept of universal grammar, that seems a very weak
terribly
notion.
weak. That just tells you got to look for it.
But so is there? If we take some other universal, but
Pardon?
if we take some other universal, but something else that's universal among people, but not animals, say music, then you could say, well, therefore there must be a universal music too, and that's fair enough.
Of course,
but then
that's true of everything.
But then the natural question is universal music, and UG, are they in fact the same thing?
Exactly, and that's a question that's, of course, being investigated. In fact, there are classical examples that go way before that. So just take a look at the history of the theory of evolution. The co-founder of the theory, Alfred Russel Wallace, raised a very serious question like that. This is, well over 100 years ago. He pointed out that all humans have arithmetical capacity, but he pointed out secondarily it's never been used. If you take a look at the history of the human species, for like 99% of it, the capacity was never used. And even at the time he was writing, whatever it was, 1880, a very small number of people have the ability to implement the capacity. So how could it be that everyone has it? Well, it couldn't have come from natural selection. That's obvious. So he concluded that there's a paradox. He said there's got to be some other principle of evolution beyond natural selection. And he and Darwin disagreed about that, but the problem was left. How do you account for this universal capacity since it couldn't have developed through natural selection? And there's a plausible answer to that, I think. I've written about it. I think the plausible answer is that if you take the core computational principle of language and you merge the lexicon to a single element, you get arithmetic. So it could be that this thing just piggybacks off language, which shouldn't surprise anyone. It's a digital infinite system, and they're very rare in nature. And language is a digital infinite system, so, maybe it just piggybacked off it. Once you have language, you have the basic core combinatorial operation of language. You restrict the lexicon to a single element, then it turns out you get a model of arithmetic. Sequence of natural numbers, addition, multiplication, everything that's required to build up arithmetic. Now, that would sort of fit with the famous Kronecker thesis, in mathematics. The way he put it metaphorically is God created the natural numbers and man created everything else. What he meant is the natural numbers are genetically determined and everything else we construct, which is correct. The rest of mathematics is a construction and an empirical construction, like physics. So the set theory that you pick, hence all of the rest of mathematics, that's just based on empirical assumptions. Like you take the Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory or any other one you want, it makes certain assumptions which might be true, say about the axiom of choice, might not be true. But you sort of posit them in an effort to explain things. And among the things you want to explain are the properties of the natural numbers, which God gave us. They're genetic. And so this picture fits, maybe it's wrong, maybe it's right, but at least it would be a possible answer to Wallace's problem. Now, in the case of music, it's pretty much the same. Every society we know of, I don't think there's an exception that's been found, has some kind of music. Now, it's not always the same kind. Like some are tonally based, some are rhythmically based, and so on, but it's within a pretty narrow set of limits. So it makes perfect sense to look for a universal as you called it, and then to ask the next question, Wallace's question, where'd that come from? And maybe it was separate evolution, or maybe in fact it's language.
So just a very, very quick follow-up. You mentioned the idea that music or mathematics may piggyback on language, and I suppose the same point could go in the other direction too. It's not obvious a priori which direction the piggybacking is occurring in.
There's a plausible story for language being the first step. and there's no plausible story for the others. It's like anything else in the theory of evolution. I mean, suppose somebody says, Jerry Fodor has a book about this, that polar bears are white because that improves their, the probability they're surviving in the North Pole. Well, suppose it turns out that some property is extensionally equivalent to being white, like say having blue eyes. Suppose they all have blue eyes. So somebody could say, well, why is it selecting for whiteness? Maybe it's selecting for blue eyes. And evolutionary biologists kind of laugh at this incorrectly because there's an overarching story about why whiteness should work and blue eyes shouldn't work. It's not demonstrable, but it's so obvious that nobody would question it, that being white does improve, makes you hard to see in the snow, and having blue eyes does nothing. So that's the overarching principle, and the same will be true here. There's a very plausible story about how language could have evolved and had selectional advantages, which could then have been simplified to some other capacities. But I don't think anyone's ever proposed a plausible story for how it could come from music.
I was wondering if your criticism of purely statistical approach could be applied to the exemplar theory, which exemplar theory in
whether the criticism of the statistical approach could be applied to exemplar theory,
which is getting popular in phonology and phonetics.
Yeah, I don't know what it is. What's exemplar theory?
It basically says that instead of following the rules, we memorize individual items everyone that we encounter in life, and that's what acquisition does, and that's
just memorizing the individuals.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, since it's a finite system, you can't disprove it, but it's so outlandish, it isn't worth thinking about. I mean, if that were true, literally, if that were true, just think it through. That means you could invent a language in which every example was unrelated in its structure to the next example. There wouldn't be any rules at all, and you just have to memorize everything that comes along. And what this theory would be predicting is that's just as easy to learn as a language where there's rule following. And without doing the experiment, perfectly well, it's not going to work. It's the kind of experiment you don't bother trying, because as soon as you think about it, that's not going to work.
So, in syntactic structures, you gave a very prescient footnote, giving some credence to the idea that statistical modeling might be helpful in processing the kind of grammars that you were talking about.
It's not, that's obviously true. In fact, we give examples.
My question is, do you think that might be also apply to Jenny Safran's work, and that she's giving some very useful word boundary candidates, maybe augmented with some prosodic information,
which happens to be exactly
for UG to work with?
Not only that, but it was exactly what was suggested in Logical Structure of Linguistic Theory in 1955, and at that point, that seemed like the only possibility. So what Safran and the rest have shown, think they've shown, is that what was assumed to be necessary may be possible. That's what their paper was. And then, as I said, later work showed it's not even true. Because, in fact, Yang and Shukla and the rest showed it doesn't even work. As soon as you go beyond the simplified artificial language, it just doesn't work. Those techniques essentially give syllables. But if you combine it with things like prosodic structure, which is not a trivial property, involves all kind of things, then you get good predictions. So I'm not objecting to the paper, but I think it should be understood. The paper has the properties I mentioned. First of all, it's essentially studying in an artificial context, which what was assumed, in fact taken for granted, to be true 50 years earlier in a natural context, point number one. Point number two, it doesn't work, and it's a little odd that it's repeated in current papers because it's known for years that it doesn't work. And something else, which is much more interesting, seems to work. And three, it is an extremely superficial property of language. So even if it works, the idea that from that you can conclude, well, the null hypothesis is you have only one method, statistical methods, I mean, I don't think you can get away with this in any of the sciences, even near it, you know, because such a crazy conclusion.
Just going back one step to the issue of exemplar theory and why it would be ridiculous, because it would suggest you could have a language where each item was a random sequence of syllables, and it's not even worth testing experimentally. This is an experiment that Simon Kirby's group at Edinburgh has done thousands of times, but they did a very interesting modification to it. The first person got the random sequences of syllables with random denotations in this small invented language, but the second person didn't. They got the way it looked when the first person had messed it up by being unable to remember.
So they used the material from the first person?
Yes, they did iterated learning. Then the third person got the second person's mistakes and so on for every input. After a few generations, what happened was that you got emergence of prefixes and suffixes and regularity and rules. But of course, these had just evolved not because the humans had evolved to have languages like this, but because the languages had evolved to be learnable by the students who were the subjects in the experiment.
Step. How the first person interpreted it, then how the second person interpreted that, and so on. They could have done it in a totally different way. Like you could imagine a non-human who would have seen the first presentation, then given some other totally random thing as the output, and hence the third person would be in the situation of the second person, and we'd go on like that and nothing would ever happen. What they're making use of is the fact that it is a human intelligence that is changing the first random system into something, you know, moderately intelligible for humans, and the second person is making it more intelligible for humans, and finally, ultimately, you get something that is completely intelligible for humans, which means that the whole process is dispensable, because the first person could have just, when the system was constructed, it could have just constructed a system that's intelligible to humans.
It's true that Simon has to use human subjects because no animals are intelligent enough to do this.
You can do it mechanically. But let's just have not a human subject. Let's just have, you know, we devise a program, you know, which
makes random errors?
Which doesn't make random errors. It just takes what was presented and gives its output something equally random. So it's not an error, you know, just saying the way I interpret it is any old garbage comes out. And it's perfectly plain without doing the experiment that's not going to get anywhere, because the second person is in the same situation as the first person, and so on. So of course it's never going to get anywhere. Once you take out the fact that human intelligence, whatever that is involved in the process, when you take that out, it goes nowhere. So the evolutionary explanation is nothing.
Is it right to interpret it as human intelligence? Because the Kirby group interprets it more as a bottleneck of the limitations of human cognition. They're not smart enough, they don't have large enough memory to hold the original random sequence in mind. They have this limitation of cognition. But that forces the language through this bottleneck.
No, not through that bottleneck.
Makes regularities arise.
No, sorry, it doesn't do that. It's true that there's a limitation in memory, which is why nothing like this is ever going to be worth considering. But furthermore, there's a second point. The way in which the limitation in memory is overcome is through the mechanisms of human intelligence. There's, after all, another way. You can immediately propose another way of overcoming the limitations of memory and say, okay, well, that'll do it too. And then, as I say, the second person will be in the same situation as the first, and you go nowhere. So when you drop out of it the fact that whatever human intelligence it is it's interpreting the information in its specific way, you drop that out, you get nowhere, which tells you that the whole proposal made no sense, because you can just reduce it to the first step. Human intelligence is constructing a system, you're over. That's the way every animal property would be considered. Look, this is all based on, you know, serious illusions. All the work they do, in my opinion, serious illusions about what evolution is. I mean, it's all based on the assumption that evolution is a process in which a small change takes place. And that hill climbing, you climb a little bit up the hill. Pardon?
We need to turn this one off, apparently. Is that right?
I don't know.
There's some problem with that microphone.
Okay. Is this working? Yeah, okay. Well, there's a kind of a pop-Darwinian concept, which no biologist believes, which is that they used to maybe 50 years ago, that evolution is a process of kind of small steps of hill climbing. So, you're sitting at the bottom of the hill, you make a move, you're in a new position, maybe to improve things, you go up the hill a little more, and finally, after a lot of small steps, you get somewhere. Yeah, that doubtless happens, but a lot of other things happen. And for example, it's been known for 40 years, ever since the discovery of regulatory mechanisms by Noam and Jacob, that very small changes in the timing and organization of regulatory mechanisms, the kind of genes that control what other genes do, they can lead to huge phenomenal differences. I mean, when Jacob wrote about this in the 70s, which I quoted in books at the time, he pointed out that it's perfectly possible that some minuscule change in the timing of regulatory mechanisms could carry you from an elephant to a flea. Now that seemed a little exotic then, but with the work of recent years in what's called evo-devo, it's now considered quite possible. And in fact, many things like that have been discovered, where a tiny change in some regulatory gene leads to quite a different organism. And in fact, for example, it was thought for a long time that the eye was a big problem for Darwin, because it wasn't clear how you could get to a usable eye from small changes. And there have been proposals. Dawkins had some proposals. Ernst Mayr had proposals saying, well, there are ways of doing it, and it must have been so straightforward, it must have happened hundreds of times. Well, when it was finally learned how it happened with Walter Gering's work about 15 years ago, it turned out it probably happened once. And it happened once because physics and chemistry just don't allow any other options. And his conclusion, and I think it's pretty widely accepted now, some biologists around, you can say something about it, that all eyes, human, insect, mammalian, insect, a couple of others, basically derived from the same system, which there's a class of molecules, opsin molecules, which have the property that they convert light energy into chemical energy. And some of these randomly found their way into a cell, whenever. And then there are certain physical possibilities for how systems can develop from that point. Like genes can be intercalated into gene sequences in particular ways, not in other ways. And if you work out those methods, claim is, you basically get the eyes that exist. He even suggests it may even be true of phototropism. I don't know if that's accepted or not. So it turns out, no, there weren't hundreds of discoveries of the eye. There were like one discovery with some minor modifications, and it all involves the same laws of chemistry and physics. The point, and that's, things like that are found over and over. The point is, until you have the answers, the speculative story doesn't tell you anything. In fact, it's what evolutionary biologists call just so stories. You see that something exists, you can make up all kind of stories about how it got that way. None of them are worth looking at. You can make up another one. And if you ever find the answer, okay, you found it. It may have nothing to do with the calculations. And I think that's pretty much true of the field that's called evolution of language, which again, as I say, is almost entirely evolution of communication. And I think there are a few things that maybe you can say about evolution of language, not much, but a few that are not uninteresting. I mentioned one, that it hasn't evolved for the last 50,000 years. And in fact, if you go back about roughly 50,000 years before that, double the numbers, if you like, don't make any difference. You go back shortly before that in evolutionary time, there's no evidence there was language at all, which makes it look as though whatever happened was some virtually instantaneous change. I mean, numbers like that are extremely small from the point of view of evolutionary history. And of course, it's millions of years after the separation from any other species.
I was going to say that seems to be a contradiction that you've run yourself into, because you were talking about the way radical changes in organisms could easily happen in rapid sequence in geological time. But with language, it suddenly all freezes. These delicate genetic mechanisms that make us the only language-using beings on the planet have frozen for 50,000 years. This is a point that Phil Lieberman has made, that in 2,800 years, you can convert a population of East Africans from lactose intolerant to able to digest milk. And it's happened. Same sort of thing in Tibet with oxygen.
But it didn't happen in this case. And
that's a puzzle, isn't it?
No, not at all. I mean, plenty of things have remained the same. I mean, we're very similar to bacteria in many respects. I mean, all kind of deep homologies have been discovered. And with deep conservation, right through the Metazoa, deep conservation, homologies that go way back, never change. That's in fact standard. I mean,
yes, but what about something that does change very fast
like
between pre-human primates and modern humans 50,000 years ago, and then it freezes solid? So that Australian Aborigines can learn African languages? This is inconceivable, given how fast evolution can work.
No, it's not only not inconceivable, it's perfectly normal. I mean, there are cases of very superficial properties, like skin color, say. I mean, after all, humans have evolved. Skin color is different, hair color is different, lactose intolerance is different. Maybe.
UG is frozen and stays the same.
It's like virtually everything in the organism is frozen. Virtually everything. Mammalian visual system. Our visual system hasn't changed probably for millions of years. Most things just stay the same. There are very superficial things that can be modified, like hair color, say. What Lieberman showed is, okay, lactose intolerance is so superficial, it could be modified by the environment. But there's no reason to expect that, say, we're going to, in another 50,000 years, we'll have an insect visual system.
Okay, we're going to have to round it off at this point.
I agree with that.
To find out more about UCL, please visit us at itunes.ucl.ac.uk.